At 108 meters deep in the Atlantic, you're inside a giant steel shell. During a routine drill, a terrible explosion occurs, and the submarine's forward section is torn apart. A second explosion shakes everything. Lights go out, water floods in. You're trapped in the rear compartment with 23 friends. Above you is all of Russia's navy. But no, one can reach you. Oxygen is running out. Temperature is dropping. Hours, days pass in darkness. You try to believe rescue will come because you have no other choice, but help never arrives. So what would you have done if you were trapped in that submarine's rear compartment? Before we begin the video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and press the like button. Share in the comments which country you're watching from. So today, let's go to the bottom of the Barents Sea, inside history's most tragic submarine accident, into the dark corridors of the Kursk. Chapter 1. Drill morning and the explosion. On the morning of August 12, 2000, you woke in the cold waters of the Barents Sea, that familiar submarine atmosphere where metallic smell and humid air mixed filled your lungs. Around you, in the berth, other sailors were also starting to wake. Some were yawning, while others were quietly putting on their uniforms. You tried not to make noise because in the narrow corridors, every sound echoed, disturbing others. K-141 Kursk submarine was not just a duty station for you. It was also the home where you had lived for the past 2 weeks. As you left the berth and moved through the narrow corridor, the steel walls almost touched your shoulders. Kursk was a tremendous technological marvel, but you couldn't say living inside it was always comfortable. This Oscar EU class submarine, 154 meters long, was the pride of the Russian Navy. With its double hull structure, nuclear reactors, and 18-meter width, it was like a floating fortress. It carried 24 Granite missiles. These missiles were powerful enough to sink an aircraft carrier alone. With a crew of 118, you were now part of one of history's largest submarine drills. As you walked toward the breakfast hall, you encountered First Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov. 37-year-old Dmitry was an experienced officer. There was fatigue in his eyes, but he wore his usual calm expression on his face. He greeted you with his head. You responded the same way. You didn't feel the need to talk because of the distance between you. Besides, today everyone was focused on their work because an important torpedo drill would be conducted. In the mess hall, as you bit into the bread you placed on your metallic tray, you listened to the conversations around. A young sailor was describing the excitement of participating in such a large drill for the first time. An old machinist was mentioning that the engine sound seemed slightly different from normal, but no one was taking it seriously. Everyone was used to the routine. Submarines constantly made strange sounds. This was considered normal. After breakfast, you went to your duty station. At your station, near the torpedo room, you began reviewing the control panels. The numbers on the screens showed normal values. Pressure levels, temperature, humidity ratio, electrical current. Everything was in place. You listened to the radio traffic coming through the headphones. Commanders were trying to coordinate with each other. During the drill, 2 practice torpedoes would be launched. These torpedoes didn't have real warheads, but the mechanism was the same. Toward 11 o'clock, drill preparations intensified. Torpedo room crew was doing final checks. You also confirmed at your station that systems were ready. Captain Gennady Lyachin was giving orders from the bridge. The 50-year-old captain was an experienced officer. You had been on several missions with him before. He was a disciplined, punctual, and meticulous person. His crew's trust in him was complete. At 11:30, The final preparation order came. Final procedures for loading torpedo tubes were initiated. A Type 65-76A torpedo had been loaded into the first tube. This model was an old design but was still being used. This torpedo, a weapon 7 meters long and weighing 2 tons, operated on hydrogen peroxide fuel. This fuel was known as a quite dangerous substance because it was extremely reactive. However, the Russian Navy had been using this technology for years. At 11:28, everything changed. First, you felt a slight vibration. It was as if something went wrong. But before your brain could make sense of it, a terrible explosion occurred. The sound was so violent you thought your ears burst. The entire submarine lurched forward. Unable to stay on your feet, you fell to the ground. Equipment around flew from their places. Lights started flickering. Alarm sounds began echoing from everywhere. In your earpiece, you heard screams and panic-filled voices. You tried to pull yourself together and stand up. When you looked around, you saw several friends had also fallen to the ground. Everyone was in shock. You were trying to understand what had happened. Was there a problem in the torpedo room? Had the explosion come from there? Your brain was working fast but couldn't find an answer. Only a few seconds had passed. The moment you stood up, the second explosion occurred. This time it was much more violent than the first. It was as if the end of the world had come. You were shaken with tremendous force. The explosion wave from the submarine's forward section crushed the steel hull. Walls buckled inward. The ceiling cracked. Lights completely went out. Darkness suddenly covered everywhere. Only emergency lights were on, but they were weak too. Under reddish light, there was a nightmare scene. When you fell to the ground again, you hit your head on something. You felt dizziness and severe pain. Blood was coming from your ear. Sounds from around you were muffled. As if underwater, everything was coming from far away. You tried to get up, but you had no balance. Someone grabbed your arm. It was Sergei, one of your friends. His mouth was moving open and closed. He was saying something, but you couldn't hear. A few seconds later, your hearing partially returned. You could now hear screams from around. Someone was shouting, "Water's coming." Someone else was ordering, "Close the doors." Panic had enveloped everywhere. You noticed water sounds coming from forward compartments. Metal creaks, explosion sounds, human screams. Everything was mixed together. Sergei helped you up. Together, you started running toward rear compartments. Other sailors in the corridor were running in the same direction. Everyone was trying to survive. You passed the 6th compartment. When you reached the 7th compartment, water sounds got even closer. When you looked back, you saw white, foamy waters rapidly approaching at the end of the corridor. The cold, barren sea's water was flooding in. When you reached the 8th compartment, the crew there was already preparing to close the doors. You entered. A few more people behind you jumped in at the last moment. The heavy steel door closed with a roar. The wheel was turned. Ceiling was secured. Water sounds coming from the other side of the door were frightening. Here you were temporarily safe, but you didn't know what was happening in forward compartments. When you looked around, you counted about 23 people. Some were wounded. One sailor's arm was broken. Another's face was bleeding. Everyone was in shock. No one knew exactly what had happened. Dmitry Kolesnikov was here too. He quickly started assessing the situation with other officers. Emergency protocols needed to be applied. "Everyone calm down," Dmitry said. His voice was determined, but he couldn't hide his worry. "We'll do a situation assessment. Attend to the wounded. check the location of oxygen masks. Orders started being given. You also tried to do the duty that fell to you. You checked oxygen cylinders. They were still working. This was good news. You moved to the 9th compartment. This was one of the rearmost sections. Water hadn't reached here yet, but electricity was cut. It was dark, except for emergency lights. Temperature started dropping rapidly. The submarine's heating system wasn't working. Metal surfaces around were ice cold. When you put your hand on the wall, your hand burned from the cold. Dmitri and other officers tried to operate the emergency radio. They couldn't receive any signal. The submarine's communication systems had completely shut down. There was no way to contact the outside. Your only hope was that the Russian Navy above would notice the situation and start a rescue operation. A few hours passed. Everyone was waiting silently. Some were praying. Some were thinking of their families. You also pictured your wife in your mind. Would you be able to hug her again? Would you be able to see your children? These questions gnawed at your mind. You sat waiting in the dark compartment. Kursk's steel hull surrounded you, but now it was no longer protection. It was like a prison. At 108 meters deep, in the middle of cold waters, you were trapped. Chapter 2. First Hours. Hope in darkness. The first hours passed in uncertainty. In the 9th compartment, with 23 people, you sat in darkness. The reddish glow of emergency lights gave faces a ghostly appearance. In everyone's eyes, you could see the same mixture of fear and hope. No one spoke loudly, because every word echoed in this enclosed space, increasing tension. You only heard the sound of water drops, metal creaks, and your own breathing. Dmitri Kolesnikov opened the emergency cabinets on the wall. Inside were medical supplies, oxygen masks, and chemical oxygen generators. These generators were small cylinder-shaped devices. Through the chemical reaction inside them, they could produce oxygen, but their capacity was limited. Dmitri carefully started counting them. He was calculating whether they would be enough. From the worried expression on his face, you understood the situation wasn't good. There were 15 oxygen generators. Each could run for about an hour. The mathematical calculation was done automatically in your head. For 23 people, this time wasn't enough. You started checking the condition of the wounded. Victor, the young sailor with the broken arm, was suffering but trying not to make a sound. You took out splints from the medical supply box and stabilized his arm. Andre, whose face was wounded, had stopped bleeding, but the wound could get infected. You applied antiseptic. There were no others seriously wounded, but everyone was in shock. The adrenaline in their bodies was slowly decreasing, being replaced by deep fatigue. Your hands were trembling. Your knees were buckling. Even standing was starting to require effort. Dmitri approached the pipeline on the wall. He took a metal pipe wrench. He started hitting the pipe rhythmically. Tock, tock, tock. Tock, tock, tock. This was a universal distress signal. It was a rescue sign known among submariners. If the ships above were doing sonar listening, they could hear this sound. Dmitri continued hitting for a long time. His arms got tired. Another sailor took over the duty. You all took turns hitting the pipe. The metal surface was constantly struck. Sound waves passed through the water, perhaps reaching upward. You hoped someone was listening. When the time reached 2 in the afternoon, there was still no response. The temperature in the compartment continued dropping rapidly. The thermometer showed 5 degrees. When you breathed, steam came out. Your hands had become ice cold. Even the underwear you wore under your uniform wasn't enough. You tried not to shiver, but your body was shaking uncontrollably. Your muscles contracted and relaxed. Your jaws knocked against each other. Everyone around was in the same condition. The cold was penetrating to your bones. Water level had slowly started rising. The door in the 8th compartment wasn't completely watertight. A thin stream of water was seeping from under the door. It was rising a few centimeters per hour. Initially, it had wet your ankles. Now, it had risen to your knees. The cold water was numbing your feet. You continued standing because sitting meant immersing in water. Your legs ached. Your knees wouldn't hold. Your feet had gone numb. But there was no other choice. Dmitri found paper and pen. He started writing something. When you approached him, you understood what he was doing. He was writing a report. He was recording what happened. He noted the time, situation, crew count. The pen in his hand was trembling. Letters came out crooked. Still, he continued writing. Maybe one day this note would be found, he thought. Maybe families would learn what happened, he hoped. There was a determined expression on his face. He had accepted death, but wanted to die with honor. You looked at him. There was deep sadness in his eyes. He knew the explosions were very large. Probably forward compartments had been completely destroyed. No one in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd compartments could have survived. The 4th and 5th compartments must have flooded too. Your friends had drowned there. Of the 118 crew members, only 23 were alive. The rest were gone, buried at the bottom of the sea. This truth pressed on your chest like a heavy weight. At 4 in the afternoon, the pipe hitting sound suddenly echoed differently. It was as if a response was coming from outside. Everyone froze. You tried to listen silently. Yes, there was something, a metallic sound, regular and intentional. Was it sonar, ship propeller sound? You couldn't be sure, but you became hopeful. Victor had forgotten his pain, listening excitedly. Dmitri started hitting the pipe again, this time faster, more insistently. He was trying to respond. The sounds continued. Something was definitely happening above. There were ships. Rescue teams must have started working. You felt hope reignite. Maybe you would be rescued in a few hours. Maybe special diving teams would come and extract you. The Russian Navy had modern rescue systems. There was a mechanism called a docking system. This system could connect to the submarine's escape hatch and rescue those inside. Deep-sea rescue vehicles named AS-34 and AS-36 were available. These could descend to 190 meters depth. Kursk was at 108 meters. It was technically possible. However, hours passed. Nothing happened. Sounds continued, but no, one was coming. Why was it taking so long? Why couldn't they enter? Questions gnawed at your mind. Dmitri and other officers were trying to assess the situation. Maybe the escape hatch was damaged. Maybe the docking system couldn't connect. Weather conditions might be bad. If waves were too high, diving couldn't be done. The Barents Sea could be stormy even in August. Toward 8 in the evening, you started feeling oxygen level dropping. Breathing became difficult. Your chest was tightening. Each breath required effort. Your lungs couldn't get enough oxygen. A headache had started. There was throbbing in your temples. Your eyes were starting to blur. These were symptoms of low oxygen level. Dmitri opened one of the chemical oxygen generators. White smoke rose. This smoke was actually oxygen molecules. You all started taking deep breaths. It provided temporary relief. The pressure in your chests decreased. Your heads cleared a bit. But the generator only lasted an hour. Then it finished. You used one more. Then another. Your stocks were rapidly melting toward midnight. Fatigue became unbearable. Your eyes grew heavy. You wanted to sleep, but sleeping was dangerous. If you slept at low oxygen levels, you might not wake up. Dmitri had made this applicable to everyone. No one should sleep. You should wake each other. You should try to stay awake. But your body was resisting this. Your brain wanted sleep. Your eyelids were closing. Your head was falling forward. Sergei next to you touched you. He reminded you that you needed to stay awake. You opened your eyes. You looked at him. His face was pale. His lips were starting to take on a bluish color. It was a sign of hypoxia. Oxygen deficiency was causing physical changes in the body. Skin color was changing. Nails were turning purple. Mind was clouding. Sergei asked you to talk about your family. What was happening at your home? Whether you had children. Talking would keep you awake. You talked about your wife. You told how you met your first date. Your marriage proposal. Happy days. Sergei listened. He tried to smile. Then he too talked about his own family. He described his little son. How he had just learned to walk. His first words. His voice cracked. His eyes filled. He thought he would never see him again. You didn't lie to him. You just held his hand. You sat silently. Cold water had risen to your knees. August 13th, morning came. The first day had passed. You had survived, but your condition was worsening. Water level had risen to chest level. You had to stand constantly. Your legs ached. Your muscles were cramped. Your veins were compressed. The cold was unbearable. Your shivering had intensified. You were showing signs of hypothermia. Your body temperature had started dropping. Speaking became difficult. Words got tangled. Thoughts had slowed. Your time perception was starting to disappear. Only 5 oxygen generators remained. Dmitri started using them very carefully. He only opened them at critical moments. There wasn't enough for everyone. Some were in better condition. Some were worse. The elderly were affected more. Younger ones were a bit more resilient. Wounded ones like Victor were weakening faster. But everyone was fighting. Everyone was trying to live. In the afternoon, you heard sounds again. This time it was different. It was as if a metal object was hitting the submarine from outside. Tuck, tuck, tuck. It came at regular intervals. Rescue teams must have arrived. Maybe the rescue capsule was descending onto the submarine. Maybe it was trying to connect to the escape hatch. Hope revived. Dmitri quickly hit the pipe. He tried to respond. He tried to indicate you were here. That there were 23 people. That you were alive. His voice cracked. He was crying. Everyone was crying. Tears wet cheeks. However, the sounds stopped after a while. The door didn't open. No one entered. Why were they coming but not opening the door? Your head was confused. You didn't understand. Maybe the equipment had malfunctioned. Maybe a technical problem had occurred. Maybe the submarine's escape hatch was damaged and the rescue capsule couldn't connect. These thoughts spun in your mind, but none completely extinguished your hope, because sounds were coming. You knew someone was working. You knew someone was trying to reach you. Toward evening, Dmitri started writing a report again. Bent over the paper, he was filling lines with trembling hands. He wrote the time. August 13th, 4:30 in the afternoon. He wrote the situation. 23 people alive. Water level rising. Oxygen decreasing. Cold increasing. Rescue sounds coming, but they can't enter. He was carefully choosing each word. Maybe these notes would be the only evidence. Maybe the world would learn what you experienced from this paper. As night progressed, the cold sharpened even more. Ice crystals had formed on the metal. Your breathing formed condensed vapor clouds hanging in the air. Your body temperature kept dropping. Your fingers had gone numb. You couldn't move your toes. You couldn't move your hands. Your muscles had stiffened. Bending your joints was painful. Hypothermia was reaching its final stage. Toward the end of the second night, Victor's condition worsened. His consciousness clouded. His eyes were half closed. His breathing had slowed. He no longer felt the pain of his broken arm because his body was numb. You went to him. Dmitri opened another oxygen generator. He held it to Victor's face. The young sailor took a few deep breaths. His eyes opened a bit. He looked at you. He wanted to thank you, but couldn't speak. He just nodded slightly. You nodded too. Words weren't necessary. Everyone understood everything. Chapter 3. Second day. Oxygen crisis. The first hours of August 13th morning passed in silence. In the 9th compartment, you continued standing because water level had risen to your chests. The cold had sharpened so much that you weren't even shivering anymore. Your body had gone into energy-saving mode. Your muscles had stiffened. Your joints felt frozen. The 22 friends around you were in similar condition. Some were leaning against the wall, waiting with half-closed eyes. Some had knelt, sitting in the water because they no longer had strength to stand. Dmitri Kolesnikov was still awake. He continued writing on the paper in his hand. He was recording the time. August 13th, 5:30 in the morning. He was updating crew status. Everyone alive, but weak. Oxygen at critical level. Rescue sounds stopped since last evening. He had written on the paper the question, why aren't they coming? But couldn't find the answer. You couldn't either. Above you was all of Russia's northern fleet. Hundreds of ships, thousands of sailors. Modern technology existed. Yet they couldn't rescue you. Toward 6 in the morning, oxygen level dropped to dangerous levels. Breathing now started becoming painful. Your chest burned with each breath. Your lungs couldn't find enough oxygen. Your heart rate had slowed. Your pulse was working irregularly. Dizziness had intensified. Your eyes were darkening. You had started seeing double. Faces around were blurring. Dmitri opened one of the last oxygen generators. White smoke rose. Everyone bent toward it. You tried to take deep breaths. Temporary relief came, but it lasted very briefly. The generator ran out after half an hour. Now only 3 remained. Dmitri was carefully storing them. He was saving them for the last moment. But when would that moment come? Today? Tomorrow? You didn't know. Your time perception had completely disappeared. You couldn't tell whether hours or days were passing. There was only darkness. Only cold. Only waiting. At 8 in the morning, Sergei's condition worsened. You were standing next to him. His breathing had slowed very much. His chest was barely rising and falling. His lips had turned completely purple. His face was white. His eyes were open, but his gaze was empty. He was looking at you, but not seeing. You held his hand. It was ice cold. You tried to check his pulse. It was very weak, almost imperceptible. You looked at Dmitri. He came to. He checked Sergei's condition. He shook his head. There was nothing to be done. Sergei closed his eyes a few minutes later. His breath stopped. His heart stopped. The 33-year-old sailor died without seeing his little son again. He was the first loss. The first, but not the last. Dmitri noted this. August 13th, 8:15 in the morning. First casualty. Sergei Popov, 33 years old. Machinist. Carbon dioxide poisoning and hypothermia. His hand trembled as he wrote the lines. Tears fell on the paper. They blurred the ink. Toward noon, Victor also lost consciousness. The young sailor hadn't spoken at all in the last hours. He was just waiting silently. His broken arm had swollen. He had probably gotten an infection. His fever had risen. He was having shivering fits. Then he suddenly calmed down. His eyes closed. His head fell forward. His breathing slowed, then stopped. He was 19 years old. He hadn't even had a chance to write a letter to his family. Dmitri noted this too. Second casualty. Viktor Kuznetsov, 19 years old. Hypoxia and sepsis. At 2 in the afternoon, water level reached neck level. Now you had to keep your chins above water. You stood on your tiptoes. You held onto walls. But water kept rising. A few centimeters per hour. You calculated it would completely fill in a few hours. You would drown. Water would kill you before oxygen. Dmitri noticed this. He decided to move to the 8th compartment. Maybe the water level was lower there. Maybe you could gain a few more hours. You tried to open the door, but water pressure was too high. The door wouldn't open. You pushed together. 4 of you were forcing it at once. Finally, the door opened slightly. Water gushed out. A whirlpool formed. You quickly moved to the 8th compartment. There was less water. It was at waist level. You had gained a few hours of breath. The 8th compartment was a wider area. Here were torpedo tubes, electrical panels, control systems. But all were useless. Electricity was cut. Systems weren't working. Only emergency lights were on. Reddish light reflected on metallic surfaces. Shadows danced on walls. It was as if you were inside hell. At 4 in the afternoon, you started hearing sounds again. This time they were coming from closer. It was as if someone was hitting the submarine's outer hull. Metal rattles were heard. Regular beats echoed. Rescue teams were still working. They were still trying to reach you. A spark of hope ignited again. Dmitri started hitting the pipe. He tried to respond, but his arms no longer had strength. He was hitting weakly. Sounds were barely coming out. At 5 o'clock, Andrei's condition worsened. The wound on his face had gotten infected. His fever had risen very high. He was delirious. He was calling for his mother. He was describing his home. He was remembering his childhood. His eyes were open, but he wasn't seeing. He was somewhere else, in another time. Dmitri touched him. His forehead was like fire. It wasn't hypothermia, but hyperthermia. The body was fighting the infection, but losing. Andrei died at 6 o'clock. Third casualty, 31 years old. Electrical technician. Sepsis and organ failure. Dmitri noted this too. The paper was almost full now. The list was getting longer. Names were multiplying. How many more people would die? How many more names would be written? These questions spun in your mind, but you didn't know the answer. At 7 in the evening, oxygen level dropped to the last degree. Breathing had become almost impossible. You felt like you were suffocating. Each breath had become torture. Your eyes kept darkening. You felt like you would faint. Dmitri took out the last 2 oxygen generators. He opened one. White smoke rose. Everyone clung to it. They tried to pull in the oxygen. They tried to fill their lungs with life-giving molecules. But one generator wasn't enough for 20 people. Everyone couldn't get enough. The generator finished half an hour later. Now, only one remained. The last one. Dmitri continued to keep it stored. He was saving it for the last moment. But that moment was rapidly approaching. You all knew this. You all felt it. Death had now become visible, tangible. It was felt in your breaths, in your veins, in your hearts. At 8 at night, sounds came from outside again. This time, it was much closer. It was as if someone was trying to open the escape hatch. Metal creaks were heard. Hydraulic sounds echoed. Mechanical movements were felt. The rescue capsule must have connected. They would enter. They would extract you. Hope exploded again. Dmitri tried to stand up. He wanted to go toward the escape hatch, but his legs wouldn't hold. He fell. He sank into water. He couldn't get up. You ran to him. You grabbed and lifted him. He was heavy. You could barely carry him. The sounds continued. Half an hour. An hour. For 2 hours they came without stopping, but the door didn't open. Nothing happened. Then the sounds stopped. Silence came again. Darkness descended again. Waiting began again. Why couldn't they open it? What was preventing them? Was the escape hatch damaged? Was the mechanism not working? Or was there something else? These questions remained unanswered. Toward 11 at night, Dmitri opened the last oxygen generator. White smoke rose for the last time. Everyone took their last breaths. They drew in the last oxygen molecules. They used the last life support. The generator ran for half an hour, then stopped. Now nothing remained. No oxygen generator, no mask, no help. Only the air in the compartment remained, but it too was running out. Carbon dioxide level was increasing. You were slowly being poisoned. Midnight passed. August 14th began. The second day had ended. The third day was beginning. 3 people had died. 20 people were still alive. But how much longer could you endure? A few hours? A few minutes? You didn't know. You just waited. In darkness, in cold, in silence you waited. You waited for death's arrival because you no longer believed you would be rescued. Hope had been extinguished. Only acceptance remained. Only waiting remained. Only the last breath remained. But even to take that breath, you had to struggle. Chapter 4. 3rd and 4th days. Last breaths. On August 14th morning, you woke in darkness. Actually, you hadn't slept. You had just lost consciousness, because with the effect of hypoxia, your brains weren't getting enough oxygen. You didn't know how much time had passed, because you had no watch, no light, only endless darkness surrounded you. When you opened your eyes, you couldn't see your surroundings because the emergency light's batteries had also run out. You had become completely blind. You could only exist by touching, by feeling. When you moved your hands, You noticed the cold water was still at your chest level. Your legs were so numb that you could no longer feel your feet. Your body had become ice cold. Your temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. You were in the final stage of hypothermia. Shivering had stopped because your body could no longer expend energy. Your metabolism had slowed. Your heartbeats had dropped to half of normal level. You were dying. Slowly but surely you were dying. When you touched someone next to you, you noticed they weren't moving. They were cold. Very cold. You tried to check their pulse, but you felt nothing. They had died. You didn't know who it was because in darkness you couldn't distinguish anyone. They were just a friend, a sailor, a human. But now they lay next to you as just a cold body. When you moved to your right, you touched someone else. This person was moving, still breathing, still alive. When you held their hand, you felt they were neither warm nor cold. They were lukewarm, as if this was the last remnant of human warmth. You hugged each other, not to warm up, but to find comfort, not to be alone, because in darkness, two humans, two souls were clinging to each other. You didn't know what time morning it was. Maybe 8, maybe 10, maybe noon. But now the concept of time had completely disappeared. There was only the moment. Only now. The past had faded like a dream, been forgotten. The concept of future no longer existed. There was only this darkness, this cold, this endless waiting. Breathing had become so difficult that now each breath required conscious effort. You weren't breathing automatically. You had to constantly remind yourself. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. You repeated in your mind, but your lungs weren't filling enough because the oxygen in the air had run out. Carbon dioxide had accumulated in its place. Poisonous gas had covered everywhere. With each breath, you were slowly being poisoned. Your head ached so much that it was as if a hammer was striking blows inside. There was throbbing in your temples. Your ears were ringing. Your eyes hurt. But in darkness you couldn't even tell if they were open or closed. Your throat was bone dry. Your tongue had swollen. No saliva remained in your mouth. You wanted to drink water, but you couldn't, because the water around you was salty seawater. If you drank, you would be more thirsty, more poisoned, you knew. Hours passed. Maybe days passed, but you could no longer understand anything because consciousness came and went. Sometimes you seemed awake. Sometimes you fainted. You dreamed. Hallucinations had begun. You saw your wife as if she was standing next to you. She was smiling at you, reaching out her hand. You wanted to hold her hand, but you couldn't, because she vanished, like vapor. Then you saw your mother. She was in your childhood home, cooking in the kitchen. The smell of hot soup, the smell of fresh bread came to your nose, but that too disappeared after a few seconds. You started hearing Dimitri's voice in darkness. He was speaking in a weak whisper. You tried to understand what he was saying. He was counting. He was counting how many people remained. 7, 8, 9. He counted while his voice trembled. Only 12 people remained. We were 23 people at the start, but now only 12 people were alive. 11 of our friends had died. More than half the crew had gone. Dimitri was still trying to write. He was writing by touch, in darkness, feeling the paper, holding the pen, filling lines. But the writing was probably crooked, illegible. Still, he continued writing because this was his last duty, last responsibility, perhaps the last message to humanity. He wrote August 14th on the paper. He wrote time unknown. He wrote 12 people alive. He wrote no oxygen, water rising, rescue not coming. He wrote the question, why aren't they coming? The question, why did they abandon us? but couldn't find the answer because there was no answer, there never had been. In the afternoon, maybe evening, maybe night, at a time you could no longer tell at all, you started hearing sounds again. They were coming from very far away, as if, like a dream. Maybe you were hallucinating. Maybe something was really happening, but you couldn't be sure. The sounds continued. Metal sounds, propeller sounds, engine sounds came to your ear. Someone was there. Someone was above. But you didn't understand why they weren't coming to rescue you. You tried to understand, but your brain wasn't working. Dmitri tried to hit the pipe, but his arm wouldn't even lift because his strength was completely exhausted. You tried to get up and go to the pipe. You started advancing, trying to find your direction in darkness. You hit the wall, fell in pain, got up again, staggered and fell again, forced yourself to stand up again. Finally, you found the pipe. You tried to lift your hand and hit, but there was no strength in your hand. Only weak sounds came out. Tuck, 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 you hit. Could someone hear these sounds? At 108 meters deep, inside a steel shell, while struggling in darkness, could someone hear? You didn't know, but you continued hitting. The sounds stopped after a while. Deep silence descended around you again. Darkness enveloped you again. Hopelessness covered your heart again. You left the pipe and returned to your place. When you sat, you sank into water, because water level had risen to neck level. You were trying to stay above water with your chin, but you were so tired that you wanted to let go. You wanted to sink into water. You wanted to finish it, but something was holding you. The survival instinct inside you, the will to live, the force of resistance was still keeping you upright. August 15th must have started. Was it the 4th day, or had the 5th day begun? You didn't know. You no longer knew anything. You just breathed, just existed, just waited. But what were you waiting for? Were you waiting for death, or were you waiting to be rescued? Actually, you were waiting for both. You wanted one of them to come, whichever came first. The person next to you had remained motionless for a long time. When you held their hand, you felt they had cooled. You tried to search for a pulse, but felt nothing. They, too, had gone. How many people remained behind? 8, 9? You couldn't count anymore because your brain wasn't working. Dmitri had also fallen silent. He was no longer speaking, no longer writing. Maybe he, too, had lost consciousness. Maybe he, too, had died. But you had no strength to check. You couldn't move. Water level had risen to your mouth. You had to tilt your head back. You had to keep your nose above water. You had to constantly struggle to breathe. Each breath was a victory. Each intake was a miracle. But these miracles were decreasing one by one, running out. The last breaths were approaching. You heard Dmitri's voice again. It was very weak. He was whispering. "Tell my family," he said in a broken voice. "Tell them I loved them," he said. "Tell my son, let him remember his father," he said. "Tell him to be proud. We fought to the end," he said. But his voice gradually weakened, stopped. His breathing slowed even more, then completely stopped. Dmitri Kolesnikov, 37 years old, first captain lieutenant, the last watchman of Kursk submarine, died silently. In his hand, he still held that paper, the last notes, the last words, the last testimony. He held tightly. You were still breathing. You didn't know how many more people were breathing, because in darkness, in silence, in this endless waiting, you could no longer distinguish anything. Maybe only you remained. Maybe a few more people existed, but you couldn't be sure. You could only hear your own breathing, only feel your own heartbeat. It was weakening, slowing, as if about to stop. Your eyes closed. You no longer wanted to open them because you were tired. Very tired. You were tired of fighting, tired of trying to survive, tired of resisting. You let yourself go. You let water envelop you. You let cold take you. You let darkness swallow you because you no longer wanted to resist. You no longer wanted to fight. You just wanted to rest, just wanted to sleep, just wanted to go. Between Kursk's cold steel ribs at the bottom of the Barents Sea, at 108 meters deep, you took your last breath. Chapter 5, Aftermath, Rescue and Truce. On August 21st morning, Norwegian divers finally entered inside Kursk. 9 days had passed. 9 long, painful, hopeless days. The Russian Navy had tried to rescue, with its own means for 9 days, failed repeatedly, finally set pride aside, and accepted foreign help. It was too late. As Norwegian divers advanced through corridors they illuminated with flashlights, the scene they saw was so terrible that even experienced men were shaken. Forward compartments had been completely destroyed. The explosion was so powerful that steel walls had been crushed like paper, crumpled, bent inward. In the second, third, fourth compartments there were corpses. Sailors had died instantly because the explosion shockwave had torn apart their organs. When they reached the 8th and 9th compartments, they found 23 bodies in water. Some were standing as if they were still waiting. Some had leaned against the wall. Some had hugged each other because they hadn't wanted to be alone in their last moments. When they found Dmitry Kolesnikov's body, there was paper in his hand. It was a wet, wrinkled paper with ink running, but it was still readable. Lines could still be discerned. The notes were a document for history, testimony for tragedy he had written August 13th, 1515. 23 people moved to the 9th compartment. None of us can surface. I'm writing here because it's hard to write in darkness, but I'll try to write. If we survive, it will be wonderful. I'm not afraid, but it's very painful, he had written. There were other notes, messages to his family, farewell words to loved ones. In the last lines, his writing had become illegible because his hand was trembling. Cold was unbearable. Oxygen was running out. Consciousness was fading. The Kursk lifting operation could only be carried out a year later, in October 2001. The Dutch company Mammoet brought a giant lifting ship. They left the submarine's cut-off forward section at the bottom of the sea and slowly raised the remaining part. The world watched on television. When Kursk surfaced, it was still imposing, but now it was a grave, a steel coffin. Inside were the bodies of 118 sailors. Families were waiting at the port. 9 years later, they were finally about to bury their loved ones. They would say their final farewells. Investigation of the explosion cause took years. The official report was announced in 2002. Fuel from the Type 6576A torpedo in the first torpedo tube had leaked. Hydrogen peroxide was an extremely reactive substance. Even a small leak could lead to disaster. An uncontrollable reaction had begun. The first explosion was relatively small, but the second explosion was terrible because the explosive material in the torpedo warhead had detonated. Then, 8 more torpedoes exploded at once. The energy released was equivalent to 15% of the Hiroshima bomb. The submarine's forward section had been destroyed in seconds. The steel hull had torn like paper. At the bottom of the Barents Sea, Kursk was buried in silence. And for those inside, time had finally ended completely. While life continued on the surface, the story beneath the sea had ended.